The Romans destroyed the Druids in Anglesey, eyed Ireland 70 miles away, but never invaded, only traded. The O'Neill dynasty moved into Ulster, and a century later the Scots started to colonise Scotland, fought the Picts, established Dalriada, expanded to Perth, and in 603 lost a devastating battle with Ethelfrith of Northumbria. Iona spread Christianity to Northumbria, producing the Northumbrian Renaissance, and Anglo-Saxon missionaries actively influenced northern Europe. The Vikings sacked Lindisfarne and Iona, and the Great Viking Army cornered Alfred the Great in Wessex. Dublin, York and Rouen were the three major Viking centres. Alfred unified the Anglo-Saxons, and the kingship of England was contested with Scandinavians until the Norman Conquest. Charlemagne transformed northern Europe, and the Normans transformed England. Ireland was a plurality of polygamous chieftains with extended families which fought fiercely for power. High King Turlough O'Conor assembled a huge fleet to plunder the O'Neills in Ulster, who enlisted Scottish Vikings in defence. Later the same year, Turlough died. Muirtac MacLachlan then ruled for a decade of treachery, blindings, abduction and murder, before dying in battle. His sidekick, Dermot MacMurrough, fled to England to enlist support. Pope Adrian's papal privilege granting possession of Ireland to Henry II served two functions. It addressed Ireland's barbarism, signalised by the Dublin slave market, the largest in Western Europe. It answered St Malachy's call for help in wresting control of the Irish Church from the lay nobility. Welsh mercenaries restored Dermot to Leinster. Strongbow married his daughter. Henry arrived in force, and in 1175 High King Rory O'Conor signed the Treaty of Windsor, recognising Henry as Overlord of Ireland. 200 years passed, and the Anglo-Normans had alarmingly integrated themselves into Gaelic culture. The Statutes of Kilkenny imposed harsh penalties to preserve English identity. The Black Death and 100 Years' War caused colonisation to dry up, and English power was reduced to the Dublin Pale. Emboldened by the Wars of the Roses in England, the Statute of Drogheda declared Irish nationhood. Henry VII defeated Richard III at Bosworth and established the Tudor dynasty. Poyning's law then established Westminster supremacy. The great Earl, having crowned Lambert Simnel, was pardoned, but imprisoned for supporting Perkin Warbeck. Later he was killed in an Irish skirmish. His son Gerald Fitzgerald insulted the Lord Deputy, degraded the Archbishop, murdered his opponents and assaulted Cardinal Wolsey. He was imprisoned in a wretched state, having been shot in an Irish skirmish. Believing a rumour his father had been executed, and prompted by his harpists' propaganda, the 10th Earl, Silken Thomas, threw down his sword of state and began the Kildare Rebellion, whose failure in 1535 ended Fitzgerald's power in Ireland. Edward Bruce crowned himself King of Ireland in 1315, devastated Ulster, and died in battle 3 years later. Ulster then became an isolated province beyond English influence. In 1541, Con O'Neill ravages the Dublin Pale. In 1542, Henry VIII declares himself King of Ireland and re-grants O'Neill his land and title. As Earl of Tyrone, Con O'Neill now nominates illegitimate Matthew his heir. He was then murdered as legitimate son Shane became the O'Neill. Matthew's son Brian was also murdered by Shane's tannist. and second son Hugh O'Neill was raised by the English, inherited the Tyrone title, but failed to become Lord President of Ulster. Audacity drove Hugh to elope with the Royal Marshal's sister, who died of neglect 4 years later, and ambition drove him into rebellion. Spanish arms fueled the 9 Years' War, but Essex dismissed a religious pretext, telling O'Neill that he had less religion than his horse. The flight of the Earls in 1607 marked the end of Gaelic Ireland. Plantations continued as the Tudors segued into Stuarts. Thomas Wentworth was made Lord Deputy, introduced the rigours of thorough, and in 1641 plantation injustices finally provoked rebellion. James Butler, the Duke of Ormond, raised in England under the negligent guardianship of Bishop George Abbot, became Lord Deputy of Ireland. Fought Catholic rebels, then allied with them against parliamentarians, finally fleeing into exile as Cromwell brutally reconquered Ireland. Land seizure accelerated under the Commonwealth. Charles II's restoration returned some land to Catholic loyalists. Then James II returned some power to Catholics, appointing the Earl of Tyrconnell, who purged Protestant officers from the Irish army. The Immortal Seven invited William of Orange to be King of England. His life's work was opposing the tyranny of Louis XIV, to whom James II now fled for support. The Battle of Bantry Bay enabled France to land supplies, and England declared war a week later, joining the Grand Alliance against France. Defeat at the Battle of the Boyne and Aughrim led to the Treaty of Limerick and the flight of the wild geese, as Irish nobles and soldiers fled to fight for France. After this, Irish emancipation and independence became a political struggle until 1921 with the founding of the Irish Free State.